Okay, so again, welcome to those who are just joining us to the STAR session on applying for graduate school. And I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat for those of you who just came in. And so this is part of our STAR Scholars Program. And so this is a program that's designed for the fall sessions are for everybody, regardless of whether you're here at Michigan or not. And then in the winter, if you are here at Michigan, we have a targeted mentor program that you can apply to. And that's especially for first and third year students who have a strong interest in diversity and who would like some extra mentorship on getting involved in research. So we have the flyers here. We absolutely encourage you to come and apply to them and come to other sessions in the fall too, regardless of whether you're here at Michigan or not. These are for everybody. So applying to graduate school is hopefully not something that you do just in your senior year. You want to also begin preparing for it as soon as possible. So yeah, if you are a freshman or a sophomore, do not feel out of place here. It's actually terrific that you're here. You want to start early by building your skills, getting involved in research and doing summer programs. And then by your junior year, ideally, you're starting to settle in on your research area. You're starting to figure out what is it that I want to study in graduate school. And you might not have your exact question yet, but you're at least starting to figure out, well, do I think I want to go more clinical? Do I want to go more cognitive? Do I want to go more biopsychology? Maybe I'm really interested in social psychology. Which one is it that I really want to do? By senior year, ideally, you've completed an independent study or a senior thesis and you're starting your application process. But this is a process that really takes, everybody's on their own timelines to some degree. And so if you are in your senior year and you're only just starting to get interested in this and realizing, hey, wait, is this, am I too late? You do not need to panic about that at all. What you may need to do is if this is your senior year and you're just getting started, and if you don't have any research experience yet, what you might want to do is get started by doing a post-bac. So basically doing some more research work after you graduate. And I'm going to drop a link into the chat that has some job openings for that. So that's a really good place to look. And then another one that often has a lot of useful links is right here. So the second one is not exclusive to psychology, but it's still a pretty good resource overall. So should you apply this year or wait? If you feel like you're not quite ready yet, if you feel like I don't have the time to apply to this year, or I'm not sure if I'm qualified, if you're not sure if you're qualified, I would say, talk to your mentors and see what they have to say. If you are still unsure, then we'll go ahead and walk you through this flow chart. Let me also just stop for a moment and acknowledge this question in the chat. So somebody asked if you have something similar for postmasters. I would say the jobs that you will be looking for as a post-bac or a postmasters, if you're using them as a stepping stone to apply to graduate school, they're probably going to be pretty much the same, except you're going to be probably qualified for jobs with more responsibility as a postmaster student. And so that's something I would talk to whoever your master's advisor was about helping you to sell that, or we can also talk to you a little bit after the session about how you would put that onto your CV. Does that help, or do you still have questions? Okay, great. So If you wait, you'll have at least another year of grades. As somebody was just saying, sometimes you might do a master's, you may have some awards. You may also have a chance for those of you to write more intelligently about your senior thesis if you're writing about it after it's done and you've had all the feedback from your mentors. So some things that you may want to think about as you're deciding that process of whether or not to apply. One thing is, have you taken the GRE and do you have a high GRE score? This is less important than it used to be because a lot of places now are doing away with the GRE. But if you do have that, then that I would say is a reason that you could think about moving forward. If you don't, then, or if it didn't go well for you the first time, then I would take a look at the schools that you want to apply to and see if they even require it. If they do require it, then consider retaking the test. You can also consider a full-time research job or a master's program. Here at Michigan, we have a program called the Accelerated Master's Degree Program. And I can say I had a student who was an amazing student, did really well in the lab, but just was horrible at taking tests. And so her GREs just always were awful and in the basement. She did the AMDP program with us and then went on and did a really brilliant job in the PhD program at Washington University in St. Louis. Matter of fact, I just saw a talk that her advisor gave about her PhD research, and he was incredibly proud of her. If you have a high GPA, that is also something that's going to help improve your chances. If you've had a chance to build that record, that's great. If you did not get a chance to build that record, you have some rough spots. Again, a lot of us, especially in that first or second year, we're still getting used to being in college. Sometimes it can be a big adjustment, especially if you have a lot of things going on at home. You want to just then take the chance, take the time and sort of build that external track record. We really don't care that much about grades in grad school. It's much more about, can you do the work and can you do the thinking? And so this is really the critical one, I think, for a lot of people, is the research experience. And especially if your GRE and your GPA are not where you would like them to be, you can definitely make up for it on the research experience front. And again, if that's not something you have yet, then again, go ahead and spend that time in the research job or the master's program. And I do want to emphasize too, because a lot of times people who are applying to graduate school are the people who sort of are the high achievers and feel like they always have to do the biggest thing as the next thing. I will say my most successful graduate students have been the ones who took a couple of years off and spent some time in a research job because they really knew what they were doing. They were in graduate school. They knew why they wanted to be in graduate school. And they just have that couple of years of life experience under their belt. So do not feel you have to do it right now. You should have a strong idea of what you want to study. One thing I always say to people is that as you're going around to the different labs and interviewing, you should ask yourself the question of, can I see myself being up at 2 a.m. analyzing data for the projects that are going on in this lab and being excited to do it? Because the reality is that as a graduate student, you're going to be up at 2 a.m. sometimes analyzing data, so you might as well be excited about it. So you want to have a good idea of what it is that you want to study. And that's also going to really help your applications, because another thing that we take a close look at in the applications is that personal statement and the research statement. And if we can really see your interest and your passion for the work coming through, that makes a very big impression on the admissions committee. I see you have another question in the chat. So somebody asked, what would be considered a lot of research experience? I would say a year or two is probably where you want to start with that. So if you're somebody who has done a senior thesis and you maybe had at least a year in the lab before that as a more junior researcher, that I would say is what a lot of especially upper level schools are going to be looking for. And then anything that you get on top of that is bonus and is only going to help strengthen your application. I guess let me ask the grad students who are on here if you guys have, does that roughly concur with your take on it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was going to introduce myself when I started my slides. I'm a clinical graduate student, clinical psychology, and I do feel like the majority of people that I know have done 1 or 2 years after undergrad in a research lab, even if and when they did research in their undergrad as well.
Yeah.
So at least in that discipline, I think it is pretty common to have 1 or 2 years outside as well.
Yeah, I think clinical is especially that way.
Yeah, I would say for biopsych, it's like common to do both, but I'd say like 1 to 2 years in undergrad is usually sufficient.
Okay.
I would agree, similar for developmental, as long as you have some kind of history of it. It doesn't have to be outside of undergrad, it can be during your time.
Terrific. All right, thanks guys. And the other is just, you know, life experience. It is true that, you know, once you start into this path, it is kind of an intense one. So if you want to take that year and go backpack Europe, you know, or you drive Route 66, or just get some life experience doing something else, join the Peace Corps. A lot of people do things like join City Corps. Now is a good time to do that sort of before you start on that graduate school path. So I won't say it's your last good chance ever, but it will be your last good chance for a little while. So somebody asked, so can the same be said for a master's in health administration? So Hayana, can you expand on that? Do you mean like, would people want the research experience, or is the master's in that useful for graduate school? I'm not trying to understand the question. Oh, I'm afraid I can't hear you. So yeah, I'm going to move on. Oh, is research wanted and praised? I am less sure for the health administration. What I would do is maybe talk to some of your professors in the health administration program and get their advice about what they would suggest for that, because they're really going to be the experts for that specialty. And so, you know, if you hit, you know, all of those yellow boxes and you feel like you're ready to go into it, then go ahead and apply now. But if not, again, it's very common and can even increase your chances of success to just wait for a bit. So don't feel bad about waiting if that's the better option for you. And again, one more plug for our fall seminar series. I know that it's a little easier than it used to be right during COVID, but for a lot of folks, it's still tough to find that research position. So we are going to have an upcoming session at end of October that is how to get involved in research as an undergraduate, and also what to do if you can't get a position this year. So other things that you can do to build your CV and make yourself a strong applicant both to graduate school and to future research positions. So you can go ahead and get that off the flyer, and I think this is the right link here as well. So let me drop that into the chat too. Okay, Yvette, it is your turn.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yvette Gonzalez, and I'm currently a 5th year in the biopsych PhD program here at University of Michigan. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the timeline of applying for graduate school. So starting in the summer, especially if this would be good to plan, especially if you're in your junior year going on to your senior year and you plan on applying during your senior year or next year. It's definitely not too late to apply currently, but you would definitely have to rush your application. So just kind of keep that in mind. But some things to start off with in the summer is first looking for your graduate schools and your advisors. You typically want to look at each school based on your advisor, right? Because it's a little bit different than when you're applying for undergrad. You know, for undergrad, you're usually looking for the name of the school and like where they're like really good for majors. But for graduate school, you're really focusing on the research and the research mentor, and that's really what's gonna help for to have like a better fit for graduate school. So you would want to start like an Excel sheet or just like a list going of kind of like what graduate schools and advisors you're interested in. And then also studying and taking the GRE. This can also be done earlier. I know some people start like the semester before, and they take do the semester before and take the summer actually to retake it in case, you know, they didn't get the score that they want. So that way they don't have to worry about it in the fall. But you can also start in the summer and then retake it in the fall. If you're just to answer the question really quickly, if you're planning to take a gap year, this timeline will be generally the year that you're applying. So probably next year once you're like starting to apply. And then another thing you definitely want to start over the summer is start organizing a spreadsheet with the application, looking at the deadline, what things they require, such as which transcripts, how many letters of recommendation you need, and those kinds of details are really good to have on a spreadsheet, and especially for your recommenders, like any deadlines or portals that they might look into. It's really good to have all that information when you send it out to your recommenders, so they can also be organized and send your letters of recommendation on time. And anything to make things easier for your letters of recommendation, they're more likely to say yes because it's a much easier process for them. And then around September, you really want to start thinking about your statement of purpose, starting it. And the hardest thing is to kind of start it. But my biggest advice to start it is just to write. Don't think about too much about the information, just kind of start writing. And then as you go throughout the semester, you can begin editing it. Then in September, October, you definitely want to ask for your letters of recommendation. You want to ask early, as most of the deadlines are November, December, and typically you want to ask your letters of rec with time. And then any potential advisors. So sometimes the advisors that you're like looking into, they might not actually be taking students that year, or and their website might not be updated. So contacting them and asking them if they will be taking new students is good, because then when you're applying, and if that was the only professor that you were interested in, they're not taking students, then you can take that school off your list. So it's kind of good to have that in mind. So that will also help narrow down your list as well. And then sending your around October, November, you want to start sending your GRE reports, transcripts, just to make sure that they get it on time before the deadline. And that's like one less thing that you'll have to worry about. Just send that in and then check up on the school, make sure they actually received those reports and transcripts. And then around November, December, as you're getting closer to the deadline, you make sure to remind your letters of rec writers that the deadline is coming up. Just a gentle push if they haven't submitted anything yet. And then in December, you want to submit your applications. That usually most of the applications are between late November, either December 1st or December 15th. Those are the typical deadlines. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then you want to verify that your applications are complete before you hear anything in January. And then we have two questions really quickly. It says, what are the types of letters of rec? The types of letters of recommendations are usually from professors and the people you've worked with in your research lab. So your mentor who you work with in your research lab, things like that. You can get letters of recommendations from graduate students, but preferably you want it to be a professor. And so those are kind of the ones that they're looking for. Cindy, do you know if we'll be going over the how to ask for letters of recommendation?
Yeah, I think we do have a slide that sort of that gives a sample letter of how you would ask a little bit for a letter of recommendation. In general, you'll want it to be a professor who knows you well in class. And yes, it would apply for both master's and PhD programs.
Yes. Great. So this timeline would be during your senior, if you're planning to not take a gap year and apply for the following fall. But this timeline is essentially for the year that you're planning to apply to. So if you're taking a gap year, then the next year when you're applying to send your application, this is when you would have take a look into this timeline and kind of have that in mind. Great. Oh, sorry, can you go back 1 second? Oh, there you go. And then so once you turn in your application, generally around January, February is when you start to hear back from the schools. And then they typically invite you to visit their campus or interview on their campus. And so around like February, March is when you'll actually travel to these schools. And then around March is when you'll start hearing, if you haven't heard from any schools, this is probably when you'll start hearing back from schools if you didn't get into the program. But the also you also get good news depending on how your interview went as well. And then usually all final decisions are due by April 15th.
All right. Hi, everyone. I saw another question in the chat about letters of recommendation, but I know that we do have some slides about that later on. So I wonder, Anna Patricia, if you want to take those questions later on, or if you'd like to answer them now.
I can cover them when I'm going over the letters of rec.
Okay, sounds good. Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Bezic. I am a third-year clinical psychology PhD student here at Michigan. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about selecting programs, figuring out which one is the best fit for you. So as you can see, there are a number of different areas of psychology that you can go into. And so this is just an assortment of all of the different types of programs that are out there. And we just wanted to provide you with a list just so that you know, there are a lot of options when we talk about applying to grad school, and you might want to do research on different paths that you could take. So so in terms of selecting a program, you have a lot of options. I think this first bullet maybe sounds a little obvious, but I think it's actually really important to consider. So what career you might want to have is definitely going to be related to which program you go to. And so I think that something that can be helpful is to think about, what do you want your day-to-day to look like in your career? Do you really want like a person forward career where you're doing more clinical work, engaging with clients? Do you really like data analysis? You could do that, in more of an industry setting and more of an academic setting. So there are a lot of different paths. And I think that considering what different career options there are for people who have gotten different types of degrees is a really helpful way to select the types of programs you want to apply to. And part of making that decision is really deciding what you want to study. So maybe if we could advance one more. So this is going to be related to, faculty members who have those research interests. And Yvette was talking a little bit earlier and kind of foreshadowing this and saying that you're going to be matched with a specific faculty member when you commit to a program normally. And so you want to figure out what kinds of research questions you're excited about exploring and answering. And then you want to apply to programs with faculty members who are doing those things. And as Dr. Lustig was saying as well, these are things that you're going to be studying for years, potentially, writing a master's thesis and a dissertation on. So hopefully these are areas of study that, you're really going to be excited about for an extended period of time. And something that's interesting that I feel like I didn't know as much earlier on is that there are people in different departments that do similar kinds of research sometimes. So, you may have interests that actually fall into the range of social psychology and developmental psychology, or even clinical. And so because you are trying to match with a faculty member who studies things that you'd like to study, it's important to consider different programs and different areas that you might match with. Even if you think, your interests are in social psychology, maybe there's a professor in another department who does really cool, relevant stuff that you might want to consider as well. And the exception there with clinical is that there are people in non-clinical departments who might do research on, psychopathology or clinically related topics. But if you want to get clinical training and work directly with patients in your master's or PhD program, then you would need to be in a clinical program where you're going to have the access to do that kind of training. And then this last point is just a recommendation to do what I would call maybe informational interviews. So that is kind of talking to people, not because you're necessarily going to work with them, but just because you want to know more about what they do. So maybe professors at your current university, grad students in different labs, people who just have the career that you're interested in, and hearing their career paths or their training trajectories, I guess, can be really helpful in figuring out, what they did to get where they are and whether that fits with what you're looking for. So I think I'm ready for the next one. So then another thing to consider in terms of kind of graduate programs is that there are a lot of different responsibilities that you might have when you're in a grad program. And so figuring out what kinds of things you want to spend your time on can also influence what type of programs you apply to, including wanting to spend more time doing research in a career, being more interested in a very kind of teaching heavy job, or more of a clinical career, which is probably what's represented by practice. I'm ready for the next one. Thanks. And so these are just some resources that might be worth checking out. There's a lot of different books and resources online that you can find, but these are books that I think can be really useful because they essentially just compile a huge list of programs that are currently available throughout the United States. And so they offer, program and department descriptions, what degree requirements they have, or if you're applying their admission requirements. For clinical positions, they also will likely talk about whether they're accredited programs, which relates to licensure, and, other key dates in the application timeline. So yeah, I think Dr. Austin made a great point there. You can see if you can find, borrow these books from someone, see if your library has them.
Most university libraries will have them or be able to get you them through interlibrary loan. And they are fairly expensive for a book you're probably going to use for 1 or 2 years. So I would say get it from somebody else if you can.
Good point. Okay, so then researching programs. So Yvette was starting to talk about this as well in the timeline. This is really early on in that timeline. These are the first few steps. So figuring out what schools you're going to apply to. And so in order to find schools, maybe we can put like the next 3 up there. So these are 3 places that might be helpful in terms of narrowing down that list. And so one source is actually just the research that you might be exposed to in your classes or in the research lab that you may be working with. And so essentially, if you read an article that you think is really interesting, check to see, especially that last author. Often the last author in the list is the senior author. So it might be their lab who put the research out. So check to see where they work and, what their lab is doing. Also, obviously, talking, just like I said before, to advisors, professors, grad students about, how they found schools, what schools they applied to. And then there's lots of lists out there in those books that I mentioned and also online about rankings of different programs. And then in terms of what to look for, so there are a lot of things to consider in terms of what programs you might want to apply to. One of them that we're going to keep coming back to, right, is this match with faculty research interests. So you can often look at department websites. Normally faculty will have a little blurb or even their own website. Like I was saying before, with the faculty publications, you want to look specifically at publications that were more recent. Someone might have published a really cool paper 10 years ago, but they might not be doing something very similar to that anymore. And so you want to make sure that you're looking at their most recent publications, and Google Scholar is a really good resource for finding current papers in case their lab website is not completely updated. And then another thing to consider is just kind of the broader feel of the program and what they require when you're there. So, I think that this can be represented through what the program puts on their website, what they value, how they conceptualize training, the vibe of if you know anyone who's ever attended grad school at that place, or, just things that you've heard about that program. I think, everyone's experience is going to be a little different. So you can always take those things with a grain of salt. But I think it is important to trust your gut in terms of how you feel that program is kind of marketing themselves, and if that meshes with what you're looking for. Great. And so this is a visual example of that Excel spreadsheet that we were talking about earlier. So with grad programs, it's daunting, but there are a lot of them. And I think that it's really doing you a disservice if you don't consider, what options are out there. So we kind of recommend that you start out by just putting everything down on paper and just saying anything that you might be interested in, right? So these are a couple of different columns of things you might want to track, like the name of the school, where it is, when the application is due, and how much that application costs. Also, whether they require transcripts to be sent, official or unofficial, what professors you're interested in working with, and then also what materials they require in their application specifically. So I think that this was a lifesaver for me when I was applying, because having it all in one place is really helpful for staying organized, and just making sure that you're keeping up with all the dates and the potential places you're considering. So moving on to the, we're still in the pre-application phase here, but these are just a couple more questions to consider as you are narrowing down that list. So as we've been talking about, make sure there's faculty there that are doing research you're excited about. Also, as Yvette mentioned earlier, faculty don't accept students every year. So, there are differences in how programs do this, but typically there's funding for a couple of faculty to take students every year. Not every faculty member will. And so essentially that means that you want to make sure that the professors that you're interested in working with are actually looking to take someone to work with them. So I'll show an example of an email in a couple slides, but we're going to walk you through a little bit about contacting these professors in order to figure out if they're taking students and kind of just getting your name on their radar. And then, as I was saying before, you want to check the publication record. Maybe we can do two more that are kind of relevant questions here. So the first one is how often they publish with their students. So maybe you've heard the term or the phrase that publications are kind of like the currency of academia. What that means is essentially that people really value, publications as your product from your graduate school. And so because you want to be putting out your work and publishing the projects that you've been working on, it's really important to see that the advisors are supporting their students to get their work published in journals. And so everyone's going to have a slightly different rate of publication, especially across different fields and the kinds of data that you're working with. But I think it's just important to see that they are publishing with their students. And also that these publications are, quality or higher quality, and that, there are different journals and stuff like that that people might publish in. And so just kind of checking those sorts of things out. And then I think there's one more on this slide having to do with the status of the professor. Status can mean a couple of different things. So obviously that could mean kind of like notoriety, how famous the professor might be for the research that they do. But there's also different levels of professors, which you probably or may have come across in your undergraduate training. So there are assistant, associate, and then full professors, I think. And so the assistant professors are the ones who were most recently hired. They're going to be the newest. They typically have the smallest labs. And that means that they're normally really involved involved in their grad students' work, because there's less students that they're working with. They're kind of getting their studies working or started from the ground up. So you might get more personalized attention from assistant faculty, but they're in an earlier stage of their career. So that's something to consider as well. That associate professor is kind of that middle ground area. They have not just started their career, or rather their placement at that university, but they might have a slightly larger lab. And then finally, a full professor is, so I think associate, they've reached tenure, but they are not a full professor yet. And then a full professor has tenure and has been at the institution for longer. And essentially, full professors are the ones who might have more connections or larger resources because they've been in the field for longer, but they might also have larger labs. And so you might be working more with more senior graduate students or postdocs because the lab itself is larger and the mentor doesn't have as much time to meet individually with each member of the lab. And every professor has a different mentoring style. So you want to talk to the people in the lab to get a feel for that as well. But those are kind of the broad generalizations of how those different stages might look. And then for getting to your final list, so you've done a lot of research, you've looked at a lot of different programs, and now we'll go through just a couple more things. Maybe we can, look at these next couple. So basically, we're just going to remind you of it again and again. Research interests. Also, as you're reaching out to professors, you might get responses from some of them, and having positive contact with them might mean that it's a better fit or feel for you. Also, obviously, there are a lot of criteria in the application process. And so if you're meeting kind of those average scores for their GRE, maybe GPA, research experience, those are sorts of things that are going to be important for figuring out that a program is a good fit for you. And then also this idea of 2 or more potential advisors is a really big one. So essentially, there might be one person at a university who's doing your dream work and it seems really cool, but they, one, might not be taking students, and 2, even if you go to work with them, sometimes things happen and you ultimately need to switch labs, or that professor moves to a different institution and you don't want to move institutions. And so because there are these things that are out of our control, if they're the only person that you wanted to work with, you might kind of be in a tough spot trying to finish your dissertation or get the research experience that you want if you no longer can work with them. So if there are 2 people that you're really interested in working with, then you have a little bit of buffer room for that, both in the application cycle and also in your graduate training. And then in terms of making a list, so this is also kind of like an art. You want to, apply to a range of schools. And so obviously there are going to be some schools that are just very competitive, no matter how awesome and qualified you are. And so you kind of want to just build your list to improve your chances of getting in. And so what that means is that you want to have some schools where you feel like it's kind of a slam dunk for your qualifications and your interests. And those might be more safety schools. And then reach schools might be the ones that are a little more competitive, or maybe a little bit of a reach from what you're currently working on to what could be really cool to work on, but you want to shoot your shot. And so those are your reach schools. And then hopefully there are a couple that are in the middle that you also are interested in applying to. And in that interview phase, the last thing is just, not telling people which are your safety or your reach schools, because that can be an uncomfortable situation. So kind of staying away from that discussion. It's more for you to know. And then in terms of contacting professors, so this is what I was mentioning earlier. You want to get your name out there, contact the professors that you're interested in working with, and potentially get some more information from them. So we can advance a little bit. So first, what you want to do is introduce yourself. And this is going to be a really brief introduction. Professors get many, many emails every day, but you want to just say who you are, where you're working, and how your research interests overlap with what they're doing. Some of the questions that you might want to ask are whether they're taking students, what their current projects are, or what they're going to be studying moving forward. One other note here is that, some professors definitely keep their websites updated. And so they might clearly say on their website, like, I am taking students for the cycle of 2023 to 2024. These are some of the things I'm looking for. And that information is really great when it's already out there. So I think that, you want to be mindful to only ask questions that you can't easily find. And because that's going to reflect to them that you didn't look at their website and maybe you didn't actually care very much about, the program, even if you really do. So that's just kind of a consideration as well. And great. And then I think there's one more. So this is just a sample email that you might send. You want these emails to be personalized and, like I said, mindful of the information that's already accessible to you. So here we just have a sample introduction, your name, where you're studying, and what you're studying, saying that you're planning to apply and you're really interested in their research, specifically, X feature of it. You would say what your research interests are and maybe how they relate. And then this person went on to ask about, future projects and whether they were taking a student. And then a really key piece here is including an updated copy of your CV so that they can see what you've been working on. And, like I said, these professors are busy. Sometimes you won't get a response, even if you end up getting an interview from that school. Not every professor will respond. Some will respond and will say, thank you so much. Like, it sounds like we might be a good fit. I look forward to seeing your application. The responses are going to vary, but I think that just kind of getting your foot in the door is a really good practice for, learning some more information and for narrowing down that list a little bit more.
All right, so you've decided you're applying to grad school. We're going to go over some of the things that are involved. By the way, my name is Ana Patricia. I am a fifth-year developmental psych student. So, alrighty, what's involved in our application? As was already mentioned, there are a lot of components that make up the grad school application, and we're going to go through some of these in details. But one thing that you want to keep in mind is that this is a process in which you want to be tremendously organized. You want to make sure that you have all of your information in an easily accessible way and that you're keeping track of all the things you need. As an example, all of the schools that you're applying to will require transcripts. So you want to make sure you have transcripts of all the schools you've attended. If you've transferred, make sure that you have the transcript from your previous school, and know that some schools will require an unofficial transcript, which you can easily get from, for example, the U of M website, whereas others will require that you send official transcripts from your school. So you have to go through a more laborious process to make sure that those are sent out. Schools will also have an online application form, which is where you would put all of your basic name, year, that kind of information, as well as your essays and some supplemental or short essay responses. Finally, at the end of this list, we see that some schools require writing samples. It's usually optional, but it's highly recommended, especially if you have something like an honors thesis or a research paper that you're proud of and that you think is able to showcase the type of student and the type of writer that you are. So, getting organized. Again, we want to make sure that you have all of your documents in one place. You're easily able to access your GRE scores, your GPA, the classes you've taken, the login information for all of the different applications that you're submitting, that you have all of the information about the schools also in one place. So we talked about having that nice Excel sheet where you can see the school, the professor, when the things are due, what exactly it is that has to be sent to each school, all very organized. So because there's so many components, we almost want to think about applying as a class, something that you're spending roughly 5 hours each week working towards and just having it as a part of your schedule. There's so many components that you want to make sure you're allocating enough time to the application. So when admission committees are reviewing your application, these are the components that they're looking at. The one that's weighed the most is your research experience, but your GPA, your letters of recommendation, and your extracurriculars are weighed as well. You want to take note of the fact that the GRE is actually a pretty small portion of this chart. And that's because a lot of schools have stopped looking at GREs. So of course, for those that still ask for it, it will be taken into account when they're thinking about you as a student, but it's a smaller portion than what I think some people assume that it is. In terms of our extracurriculars, we want to make sure that you're showcasing how these provided you with skills that you can use in grad school. So these could be leadership skills related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And remember that it's better to have 1 or 2 extracurricular activities that you played a really big part in, rather than having 8 to 10 that you were just kind of involved in, but didn't have much of a leadership role in. I see some questions. Do these percentages vary based on the PhD and PsyD programs and masters? They might vary a little bit, but it's still going to be the same kind of expectation that your research experience is extremely important for any kind of grad program. Would you recommend? So I'm gonna not answer the GRE question yet because we're gonna go into it in the next slide. So if I don't answer it, make sure to ping me again. So the GRE, which we have many questions on. There we go. Do you mind? Yes. So the GRE is a 3-part test, to think of it in some ways. It includes verbal, quantitative, and an essay components. And as I mentioned, the importance of the GRE varies widely. So there are some schools like U of M that don't require it at all. And then there are other schools that still require it, but that may not be putting it at the highest of pedestals. So you want to make sure that you are checking in with the schools that you're applying for to see, do they require it? Do they have cutoffs for what your score has to be? Or do they have any other specific requirements for it? Are there certain resources or books that are helpful in preparing for it? Simple answer to that is yes. I don't have a specific link to send you for helpful books, but there are GRE prep books where essentially they have a bunch of example tests that you can take, and they tell you how to study for certain parts of it, like the verbal or the quantitative, and they have just regular practice questions as well as full practice exams.
Yeah, if you have a psychology or a research librarian at your university, they are delighted if people come to them with these kinds of questions. And so they can definitely help you also find some good resources for that. And even if you don't have it in that university library, they can probably help you find it through like an interlibrary loan.
Yes. Could we do the next slide? Alrighty, so for those of you that will have to take the GRE because it's required for the program that you're applying to, these are some things you want to keep in mind. If you're applying this year and your program or school requires it, then you want to take it as soon as possible. But even if you're not applying right away, the scores from GREs are valid for 5 years. So you're able to keep it for some time. But it takes time to receive and send the scores, and you may need to retake it, right? So if it's something that you think you're going to need for your programs, it's better to start earlier than to start later. You want to think about spending 1 to 3 months preparing for the exam. So again, using practice exams, the Princeton Review and Kaplan, that's one of the books that you could use for studying for the GREs, but there's websites, there's apps, classes, there are books, but you want to make sure that you're spending ample time studying for this exam, as it does use specific kind of skills that aren't just covered in your usual undergrad classes. It costs money both to take the GRE and to send those scores to schools, but you do get 3 free reports the day that you take the test. So when you go in to take it, you want to know of at least 3 programs that you're sending out the GRE to, or the GRE scores. That way you're able to take advantage of those 3 scores. I see that one question got asked, but was addressed in the chat. So we'll go on to the next slide. Alrighty, so the next part of the application, and arguably one of the most important, is the statement of purpose. This is a 1.5 to 2 page statement that talks about your research history, your interest, and why you want to go to a particular program. Some schools break this up into a statement of purpose and a personal statement, but today we're going to cover it as one thing and talk about what would be included in that kind of statement. So one possible structure to the statement is starting off with something interesting, but this is a bonus, right? Having a catchy start is a bonus. What we want to focus on is having clear, competent writing and giving some sort of background for why or how you got interested in the topic that you're interested in. Then you want to talk about your previous research experiences and how these led to your interest and what you're hoping to study in grad school. You're trying to build a narrative for how you got to where you are and specifically why you think grad school is the next logical step. So when you're talking about plans for grad school, especially when you're applying to research-focused programs, which most PhDs are, you're going to want to focus on your desire to do research. Sometimes there's a stigma about applicants wanting to teach or do research in industry, but either way, you're going to want to express an openness towards having an academic research track, which is what most of our PhDs are training us for. Lastly, you're going to want to talk about why you're applying to the particular program. So it's one thing to have the research interest, but why this specific program? This is especially important because one of the biggest things that schools look for is the fit. So you can be an amazing candidate with high GRE, high GPA, but if your interests don't make sense with what the program focuses, then you're not going to be a strong applicant for that program. So you want to talk about what makes that school feel like the number one choice. Even if you're applying to 10 different schools, you want to express that each school is your perfect fit and you're an amazing candidate for that program. Some other general tips: we want to avoid cliches, so being as specific as possible. We want to avoid being arrogant. So even if you are the best student in the whole wide world, you don't want to express that you're the best student, right? You want to talk about yourself in ways that are humble. You want to be concise. This is a relatively short statement, so you don't have that much space to talk about yourself and about your research. And again, you want to make sure that it's tailored to each program. The more, the better. Okay, so some examples of don'ts. We don't want cliche openings. So this statement starts with psychology has always been interesting to me. Very broad. Psychology is interesting to a lot of people. It doesn't talk about any particular research experience that they may have had. And what I was just saying about the arrogancy, it's overconfident without backing any of the things up. And it's lacking specificity. So they took several classes, they think they're prepared, but it doesn't really express why they think they're prepared or what those classes taught them or what they got out of this experience. Instead, we want to look at some of our do's. So in this one, we have a much more compelling opening. So during the past 3.5 years, they gained a wealth of knowledge from 2 unexpected sources. They go into talk about that. They go into detail about their research experiences. So they're talking about what kind of major they have, the 2 years that they spent studying mating behaviors under a particular professor's lab. They give a ton of specificity about what kind of research project they were involved in, and they communicate their findings of the thesis or research experience that they took part in. So unlike our last one, which was very vague and kind of just psychology is cool, this one's telling you that they have a very specific research interest that they've already tapped into through research in their undergraduate experience. This one continues a little bit in the next slide by going deeper into what they did and how they understood the project that they were involved in. They talk about other topics that they're interested in researching, so as to say that while they did this really cool experience, that's not the only thing they're capable or interested in doing. And then they give the specifics onto why they think that the school they're applying to is a right fit based on the things that they're interested in and have been able to do. So that concludes our statement of purposes, our do's and our don'ts. Next, we have letters of recommendation. So we talked a little bit about this in the timeline, but we want to cover some of the details. So first, who to ask. Generally, we need 3 letters of recommendation, and it's best if they come from research advisors. So people who are able to speak to your experience doing research, your ability to lead, your ability to take information and roll with it. Graduate students can help in writing these letters, but oftentimes what will happen is that you'll ask a professor who you worked with for that letter of recommendation. And if you also worked with a graduate student in that lab, it becomes a collaborative letter that's still signed by the professor that you're asking for. So we really want to prioritize those research advisors or professors. It can also come from professors or previous employers who know you well, but you want to make sure that, again, they're able to speak to your strengths rather specifically, and not just they were in my class, they showed up every week, right? We want a little bit more detail than that. And because we want that level of detail, you want to make sure that you're establishing these relationships early. You want to give professors or advisors or whoever it is enough time to know you and to be able to speak to your strengths rather than having a quick turnaround for, yep, I met them last week and now I'm being asked to give them a letter. So how do we ask? We want to make sure that we're asking at least 1 month in advance. Professors, just people in general, are tremendously busy. So you want to give them ample time to get back to you, whether it's a yes or a no, and to ask for anything that they might need. You don't want to make assumptions. So I know this is something you would be willing to do, or I think you can give me a super strong letter of recommendation. You want to go in asking without any of those assumptions. You don't want to submit anybody's contact information before they agree, even if it's not a full letter of rec, even if it's just a phone call recommendation or a quick email. You don't want to submit anyone's information without their consent. And over email is a fine way to ask. If you're able to ask in person, that's great. But I think we've gotten into the culture of emailing being more than enough. What about letters of rec from a volunteer coordinator who works within a therapeutic environment? For the other grad students, and Cindy who are in here, please answer as well. I think that works. That sounds great, especially if that person knows you well and you were heavily involved in this environment, in this like volunteer setting. Mm-hmm. I would make sure that it's paired with other equally strong letters of rec, right? So if they're all from non-academic settings, I would still look for someone who is within the academic setting, but it does seem like this would be someone who would know your skills well.
Yeah, and I guess I would say too, like, so for the research advisor one, I would say it's particularly important to have at least one that's a research advisor if you're in a PhD program. But again, people are going to have different trajectories. So some people may have worked in the same lab since they were a sophomore, and like that's the person who is their research advisor. And then your other letters might come from somebody like that if you were going to a clinical and especially a more practice-oriented kind of program, or some of you were asking about, social work masters, like then that kind of person would be great. And the other people who can write them for you are the people who've taught your upper level classes. So your 400 and 500 level classes, any class where you've written like a big paper or done some kind of project where the professor can really see your work and the way that you've done it. The other thing, if you are, there aren't a lot of folks who are like this, but if you are somebody who does really well in stats, getting a good letter from your stats professor can often be great, because that is a hard challenge for many graduate students. So if your stats professor says, hey, they really got this, then that also can be something that can make you stand out. So that's a little angle on it that not everybody thinks about.
I see another one. Is there any value to having a letter from a professor you've known for an extended period of time? Yes, it doesn't have to be a professor that is in your direct area. It just has to be someone who knows you well and who's able to speak to your skills and your strengths. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one match to the topic that you're studying.
Yeah, and sometimes if you have sort of a more varied profile among your recommendation letter writers, you can use that to your advantage and also guide them in what you want them to write about. And so then you could have one person and say, like, ask them to really emphasize your research skills, have another person really emphasize sort of your organizational and your teaching skills. So you can also, kind of give your letter writers some pointers about what you want them to aim for.
Alrighty, so once you have these letter writers, we want to think about giving them a helpful packet. So in this packet, we have the names of the schools and the programs that you're applying to, the deadlines for each of these programs, any application instructions. So do they have to go into a portal to submit the letter? Are they mailing it? Are they emailing it? What exactly is that they have to do to submit your letter? And then it's helpful to give them a draft of your statement of purpose or personal statement so that they know what it is that you gave that school, right? They know what kind of topics you covered, what it is that you're interested in researching, and they're able to touch on those things in their letter of recommendation. And then you want to pass along your CV, your transcripts, and your GRE scores, right? Any information that can help them write a strong letter that captures you as an entire student. You want to send reminders close to the email. So you want to be tracking the portal or whatever it is that shows you whether the letters have been submitted to ensure that you're reminding your recommenders to submit their letters. And then you want to make sure that after everything has been submitted and the process is done, you want to thank those letter writers. So gifts aren't really necessary, but a nice little thank you note is nice just to let them know, hey, I appreciate you for doing this, especially if you were successful and got accepted into one of the programs that they recommended you for. Next, we're gonna briefly touch on the CV. So our CV is somewhat like a resume, which I think most people are familiar with, but it's focused more on our research experience. So you still have your education, your awards, the relevant research or volunteer experiences that you've taken part in, but as you'll see in the next slide, there we go. As you see in this slide, it focuses a lot more on your research experiences. So in these bullet points, this individual is talking about what exactly it is that they did in their lab settings or in their research projects, what skills they gained, what tasks they were in charge of. It can be tremendously lengthy, right? The longer you are in the academic setting, the more things that you're adding to your CV. But even at the end of undergrad, you're able to talk about all the skills that you've gained from research experience through class, through different projects, through labs, all in this organized format. You want to make sure that this is something you're proofreading and that you're staying up to date with it by the time you send it. So even if you did something, even if you just joined a lab and are sending out the CV, that's something that you make sure to add to it before you're sending it out. All right, so those are all the components that make up the application.
Alrighty, so now we'll talk a little bit about post application submission and what to do when you're hearing from schools. And so one of the ways that you might hear back from a school to schedule would be a phone interview. And these are usually short, informal, and they're usually also scheduled before final decisions are made. So it's just kind of like an extra way to kind of get to know you, and see if you're a match for the program. And then later, usually around like January, February, you'll have in-person interviews or you'll attend a recruitment weekend. And so you'll either have been already accepted or on the possible top candidates to be accepted. And so you are invited to the schools. They usually provide funding for you to come visit the schools. And this is a good opportunity to really get to know the school itself, the program, the students, and kind of ask those typical questions to students and the professors as well. Something to note during these in-person interviews or recruitment weekend is you're basically being interviewed 24/7, and it sounds intense, but it's mostly that, like, if a grad student is picking you up, They're like definitely taking notes. If something happens, like some weird thing happens, they're definitely taking notes on that. But this is also a great time to ask questions and get information, especially from the graduate students, since you'll likely be talking to a lot of them to kind of get an idea of what like the school life, the culture is like, and also your mentor, right? Like what their lab culture might be like. And then during these interviews, some important questions to ask are, are the students independent or are they more directed, right? So this is kind of talking about mentoring style, definitely asking the graduate students what the mentor's mentoring style is. Are they more, frequently in the lab and like checking up on you more often, or are they more laid back and don't really have specific deadlines and kind of let you take the lead? Both have their advantages and disadvantages. It just kind of depends what kind of mentor you would like. And as much as, they're interviewing you, you're also interviewing them because you want to make sure that this is a good fit for both of you, and especially the mentorship as well. And then you also want to ask how many grad students does the researcher have, so you have an idea if it's a bigger lab or a smaller lab, and that'll kind of give you an idea as well of how much availability your mentor might have. If they have a bigger lab, you'll likely have less personal time, but if they have a smaller lab, you'll likely have more access to your mentor and stuff like that. And then also, what's the nature of the program? Do people tend to be more competitive or collaborative? It's always great to be in a more collaborative setting because they're grad students who are willing to help you out, and also just navigate graduate school overall. And then you also want to ask either current or past students the pros and cons of their PI, right? Like their mentoring style. Again, if you really want somebody who gives you strict deadlines and more like a structured kind of mentorship, that's really important to know. If you want somebody more, removed, that kind of just lets you take the lead, that's something that you kind of want to have an idea. And graduate students are pretty honest and will let you know what kind of mentoring style their mentor has. So those are great people to definitely ask and take advantage of, to be able to ask those questions. And then lastly, just, ask information about the financial package and also just the curriculum as well, the requirements that they may have. Do people take time off? This is something good to ask the graduate students and also the mentor. What's their work-life balance? Things like that. Great. And then when you're thinking about making your decision for graduate school, some factors that might seem super important but might not be as important. The prestige of the university, right? And the reason for that is because the research match is pretty important, as the research is really the bulk of your program. It's your dissertation, it's what you're going to be working on most of the time. So really the research match is more important. The prestige of the faculty advisor, right? Some faculty, come out with great papers, but they may not actually be like great mentors. And that's something that you'll definitely find out from their graduate students. So that's really important to find out, because while they may be, putting these important papers out there, if they're not actually helping you develop the skills that you need through this program, then it might not actually be as helpful for you. So learning the personality of your faculty advisor is really important to see if it clicks with you and your style as well. Their absolute stipend and then the location might not be as important, depending on your situation, but the location could be less important, especially if the research works really well, the graduate students seem happy and they really like their mentor and the mentorship seems to fit. That might take precedent over the location. And then another thing that you want to consider is, let's say you apply to like 5 schools and you only get into one, but you really, really didn't really like the school or the students, or weren't really thinking of going into that school and it was kind of like a backup school. You don't want to just say yes to that program just because it's the only one you got in. It would be beneficial to actually just reapply, maybe get more experience, because you want to be in a program, it's a long program, it's a hard program, You want to be somewhere where you feel like you fit, and not just because they said yes. So it's okay to, reapply and reconsider your options. But something that's really important also is, lab money. It's good to know, especially if you have a research fit and they have just a new grant going, things like that. Because being in a lab that doesn't have a lot of money can be stressful and can definitely affect your research. So taking that into account. And then again, how much time do their students take off? Like, is there a work-life balance? Or if you talk to a grad student and they're like, yeah, I haven't been in a vacation in like 2 years, you obviously wouldn't want to be in that kind of environment. So those are some important factors to consider, and also questions to ask during the research interview. And then yes, don't hang on to multiple offers for long, right? So let's say, you get like 3 offers and there's like one school where you're like, yeah, I don't really think I'm actually going to that school. As soon as you have that decision, please let them know that you're not interested, or, you're going to go with a different school, because usually they'll have people on the wait list, and the longer you keep that offer, the less likely they'll be able to reach out to that person in time to get them off the wait list. So if you're not interested in that school, please let them know as early as you can. For the question about lab money and funding, you can ask the PI. Yeah, definitely. They'll definitely let you know what grants they have going on, if they're currently applying for grants, and things like that. They're pretty open about that stuff. And then the stipend, you can definitely ask the grad students, as they're usually the ones, that know more information about that. So yeah, for the stipend, I would definitely ask the graduate students, as they kind of have more information on that. And then some optional fellowships that you can apply before you get to graduate school would be the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program. This one's usually due in October. And then also the Ford Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellowship. This was usually due in December, and I believe this is actually the Ford fellowships last year taking applications. So if you're applying this year, I would definitely apply to the Ford Foundation and the NSF if you have the availability to do it. There are research statements and personal statements that you have to do, so kind of keep that in mind. But I would definitely take a look at it now and see if it's something that you can definitely apply to, especially with Ford being due a little later than the NSF. And then with the NSF, you can apply before you get to graduate school, and then only once in graduate school. But if you don't apply before undergrad, then you can only apply once in graduate school. So if you can, I would definitely apply to the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and see, if it'll give you like an extra shot, and you also get feedback, so you can kind of have an idea of how to strengthen your application for whenever you do decide to apply during your graduate school experience. What if you apply to these fellowships but are not accepted / decide not to go to a program? I believe you could defer a year. But Cindy, do you have a...
Yeah, so if you apply to the fellowships, usually they're going to have it sort of tied into also being accepted into a graduate program. So often when you're applying to them, you're going to be talking about the research that you would be doing in a particular grad program. So they'll be going hand in hand a little bit to some degree. So if they do, so if you just write it as a more general aspect, I think that might be right, that you can potentially defer it. But again, that would be a fairly unusual circumstance to have happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, at least if I can jump in for the NSF, I believe if you do not join a graduate program the year that you are offered the award, you have to forfeit the award. So I think that one is contingent upon getting accepted into graduate school. And then the fellowships themselves, in case this wasn't clear, they're not like a job, like they serve as funding for your grad program.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to grad school, the fellowship just kind of comes with you. and provides the funding.
Yeah, and to answer the last question, which goes with that point, if you do get the NSF grant, basically just like supplement your funding. So, for example, at University of Michigan, we do have some years where you have to teach, right? But if you get the NSF, then you can lighten your teaching load because your fellowship would take precedent over, or would take over those teaching years.
Yep.
So yeah, so it doesn't hurt you, it definitely helps you. And some schools have like bonuses if you have outside funding, then they'll give you like an extra yearly bonus because you're basically saving them money. Okay, so if you're looking to apply to the University of Michigan, some things to look at, on the psychology website, we have the different program areas to kind of help you figure out what program you're specifically interested in. Then you also have information on the prospective graduate students that kind of gives you an idea of what you need for the application. And then we also have a frequent asked questions for those questions that you might be looking for. But if you don't have that, then you can always, email Psych SA for any like additional questions. In the faculty directory, you can either search for faculty by their name or by research interest. So it's kind of, if you look, if you're interested in behavioral neuroscience, you can look at behavioral neuroscience and it'll give you an idea of which professors are in that area. And then in the Rackham Graduate School admissions website, that's where you're actually submitting the application. And then it already opened in September 1st, and then it's usually due December 1st. And this year it's due December 1st. Okay, so why Michigan, right? We are at the School of University of Michigan. And one of the things about Michigan is that we have a variety of different doctoral and master's program to be able to enrich your primary program of study. We have tailored resources and support for students of different needs, right? So we have a variety of students, diverse students that come from different backgrounds, and we have different support systems for those students. Funding opportunities as well. And then one of our missions is to have diversity, equity, inclusion, which, as I mentioned, we already have some programs to support students with different needs that kind of get at that point. Okay. And some financial support examples that are also focused on helping us recruit, diverse students, and also just different types of students would be the Rackham Merit Fellowship. Psych usually has a couple of students from this program that get this fellowship. We have graduate student research grants, international research grants, and then a couple other grants. A big one is you get travel money for your conferences, and then also graduate student emergency fund, which is super helpful. If you're ever in a situation where you're suddenly suffering a financial issue, or something happened that like you have this financial situation that you weren't expecting to have this money, you get you can get this award 2 different times during your 5 years here to help you recover financially, so that you don't have to take time off your research and stuff like that to be able to make up for that money. And so it just takes a little bit of stress off of you. And then again, talking about how we have recruited different types of students. 23% of graduate students are first generation. So we have a first generation support network. We also have a bunch of student organizations, such as the Students of Color of Rackham, and they just put on different social events, different academic events to be able to bring different students from different disciplines. So you're able to meet other students. You usually get fed during these events, and you have like some fun. Last year, went to go see Black Panther together, and they provided for all the movie tickets and popcorn and stuff like that. So it was a really great experience to kind of be able to hang out with different people. And then as always, good luck with these applications. Here we have some additional resources linked for this, for your application. And, feel free to email me or any of the graduate students if you have any specific questions that you have, but, we'll stick around to also answer any last minute questions that we have in the general discussion. Great. Any other questions?
So I have one on tips or preparations for students interested in neuropsych. Yeah, so I can start on that one a little bit. I would say, that is a great one to show both in your classes, and then depending on what kind of neuropsych, if you do have research opportunities, sometimes you can find them in centers or institutes that might be associated with or near your university, but that might not be right within the psychology department. So because I do collaborations with people who do work on Parkinson's disease, and I've also done Alzheimer's work in the past, a lot of times I will get students who are applying to work in my lab, even though I'm not the one who's testing the patients in my lab. And so then I end up going and referring them over. So like here at Michigan, we have the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. We have a geriatric center. We have a Parkinson's research center. And so I'll refer students over to there because if they really want that patient experience, that's a good way to work on that. So several questions in the chat. Let's see, advice for gaining clinical experience in undergrad for people who are less interested in research. So the programs that you might be applying to there would be more potentially PsyD programs. And also that book that Jessica mentioned earlier is a good one for looking at programs and seeing how much they emphasize the clinical aspects as opposed to the research aspects. I would say, like what I've seen people do is like peer counseling programs, or if there's a mental health organization on campus, people sometimes will work at things like suicide hotlines, anything where you can sort of get that kind of training, and where you're working with somebody who's got a little bit more experience than you and can supervise you in building those skills, and then can help with writing that letter, I think is a good place to work with that. I don't know if you guys have any other suggestions on that front.
No, I was thinking the same thing in terms of opportunities for volunteering. And also there's, I don't know if you're at Michigan, but there's a program called Mood Lifters that is really like a peer-oriented clinical intervention. And so that's also something that you could explore. I know there are some undergraduate courses that are more kind of hands-on applied. I think it might be called Project Outreach, that are more hands-on applied clinical experiences. And so I would say definitely look into those sorts of opportunities as well. They might even be kind of intertwined with research, but they may be very kind of clinically oriented. So those might be things to consider too.
Yeah, and definitely, again, talk to your professors and also talk to your psychology advising office, because they have a really good idea of, like, most undergrad advising offices, they are closely tracking where the students who graduate from their programs end up. And so they can actually be really good at saying, like, hey, people who, wanted to go in the track that you did and had successful applications, here are the classes that they took, like this is what their profile looked like. They may even be able to put you in touch with people who got into that program so you can find a little bit more about it that way. I know we have an undergraduate LinkedIn, and so, like that's another way to connect people. So, just ask a lot of questions, ask everybody. Nobody's going to get mad at you for being curious. That's kind of what being in graduate school and academics is all about, is asking a lot of questions all the time. Uh,
And for the question that is it a disadvantage to apply to a PhD from a master's instead of going directly to undergrad? Definitely not, especially if you need research experience. A master's program will definitely be great for that, to be able to kind of do a thesis and things like that. So it would definitely not be a disadvantage. But if you have the research experience during your undergrad, then you can likely apply straight out of undergrad. But if you feel like you need more experience, or get your GPA up, which is not as important, mainly it's the research experience, a master's is a good way to do that as well.
Yeah, I think the only consideration with a master's is if you have to pay to participate in it.
Mhm.
So that's just a financial consideration to weigh. You could work for potentially a year or two as a lab manager or a research assistant and be paid versus getting a master's. Obviously, masters are very highly regarded and they're very valuable, but also consider whether it's really necessary for the PhD because some programs really don't require you to have a master's.
Yeah, and that will also depend too, like a little bit on whether you're applying, like we're speaking here mostly about US schools. So in Europe, it is expected more that you get the master's and then you do the PhD afterwards. In the US, it's usually a 5-year program. The other thing I would say, like when you're looking at a master's program, is ask them where their graduates end up. Because we have our master's program here and we deliberately keep it very small, and it's people who already have a foot in research and they just need a little bit more. And we actually do a lot to talk to people beforehand to say, hey, are you really sure that this is the good program for you and that we're not just taking your money? But there are some master's programs who will happily take your money, and may or may not get you onto the stepping stone. So you really want to take a careful look, because there are some master's programs that are excellent and then there are some that are just there to take your check. So you really want to take a close look at that. And then somebody put you guys in the hot seat, because like it's been way too long since I applied to graduate school to answer this question. What do you think made you a good applicant? I could give you some perspective from the PI's point of view, since I took 2 new graduate students this year, but we'll end with you guys saying some nice things about yourself, because that's never a bad idea either. I'm gonna embarrass you, sorry.
I can go first. I think for me it was definitely just research experience. In my undergrad research lab, it was just one postdoc and then everybody was undergraduates. So we were all able to kind of have our own project that we ran independently. And, when I talked to the PIs during the interview, that was like the thing that they were most excited about. And then also the topic that I was doing work on like THC, which was very new, and there's more now, but at the time it was like we were one of the few labs that were doing it, so that really intrigued PIs as well, but mainly just that I was able to do run a project on my own, and the way I described it, they knew that I actually ran it on my own because I knew the reason why we were doing the experiment, the methods, why we chose those specific methods and those specific parameters and things like that, and that they definitely that was something that they were really interested in once I was doing the interviews and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point. I think that the interviews are a really important stage, and that being able to explain why you're doing the research that you're doing and like what the rationale of the research questions are, rather than just like the things that you did in your data, like those are 2 separate things and they're both really important skills. So being able to talk about those things. And then I was also thinking like being true to what your story is and why you're interested and what your experiences have been. Like I majored in neuroscience in undergrad and then decided like I wanted to work with people and do clinical things, but also integrate that neuroscience into my research. And so I kind of talked about all those different experiences and how that path got me to where I am. And so I think that highlighting, your background and experiences as that relates to your research interests makes it more compelling and genuine, and hopefully something that the programs are really, excited to see and helps you match as well.
I agree with what's been said. I think I was passionate about the research I was doing, but I also was pursuing it in and outside of the lab. So I worked with young children learning English, and I had a research project that dealt with that, but I also worked with children out in the community. And so I think showing that you have that passion for your research and you're pursuing it in whatever ways you can. Of course, there's limitations to that based on what the topic is, but really showcasing that passion and showing that it's something that you didn't just pick up overnight, that you've been pursuing it for a while and that you're excited to continue pursuing it.
All right, great job, you guys. Oh yes, and I will say, like, the one other question that came up, I would agree with Yvette there. I think that's a perception, the perception that, you know, you can't apply to the place that you went to as an undergraduate. I think that was more true when I was applying to graduate school, and there might be like some older faculty who still have that kind of, we call it the incest bias. But I think people are realizing more and more, just because almost all of our fields are becoming more and more complicated, that there can be an advantage of somebody who, you know, can really start off in the lab on day one and, you know, knows, you know, is not also trying to make the adjustment to, okay, now I've just moved to a new place and I have to figure out the bus system and like, where's the grocery store and all of that. And, you know, can really be comfortable and just, you know, really get right into the science. So. All right, well, thank you so much, you guys. And I will, in the next day or two, I'll be sending all of you the info too on the faculty who told me that they were interested in recruiting this year. So that will be a nice little bonus for those of you who came in today. And thanks again and have a great night.